My name is Elena. I am 31 years old, and the absolute first thing I heard when I finally woke up from a 3-week, chemically induced coma wasn't the sound of a doctor checking my vitals or the comforting sob of a loved one holding my hand. It was my husband, Julian's voice, speaking in a tone so quiet, so perfectly calculated, that if my brain hadn't been completely starved for human contact for 21 days, I probably would have missed it entirely. He leaned down close to my ear, his breath warm against my skin, and whispered just 7 words. Just one more day, then it's ours. I did not open my eyes. I didn't stir. I didn't let the rhythm of my breathing falter by even a fraction of a second. I don't know exactly what primitive part of my brain took over in that moment. Some ancient protective instinct that arrived a few seconds before my conscious mind had fully finished. Orienting itself to the room, the blinding fluorescent light bleeding through my eyelids, or the heavy, unmistakable smell of rubbing alcohol and bleached linens that belongs only to places where people are being kept alive by cold machinery rather than their own internal momentum. But that instinct told me to play dead. It told me that the woman lying in that bed was far safer pretending to be an empty shell than showing even a flicker of life. Have you ever had that terrifying, heart-stopping moment where you realize you are completely alone in a room full of people who are supposed to love you? Have you ever had to sit entirely still while the world around you casually discusses how to dismantle everything you've ever built? If you've ever had to quietly gather your strength while the people closest to you counted you out, I want you to take a breath with me right now, because this isn't just a story about a betrayal that almost destroyed me. It's a story about the brilliant, silent strategy it takes to turn the tables when the wolves are already at the door. Do me a quick favor before we go any further. Drop your first name and your city in the comments below. Let's look out for each other. Because sometimes the people who claim to protect you are the exact ones you need protection from. I lay perfectly still on that stiff hospital mattress, listening as the heavy door to my private room clicked shut. I could hear the distinct, expensive click of my stepmother Catherine's designer heels pacing across the linoleum floor. "Is she still stable?" Catherine asked, her voice carrying that polished, completely manufactured warmth she had used on my family for over a decade. "The night nurse said her EEG patterns are identical to yesterday," Julian replied, and I could hear the rustle of his tailored jacket as he shifted his weight near the foot of my bed. "The hospital won't issue a permanent neurological prognosis until Monday," Vance said, "as long as we file the emergency corporate proxy before the official capacity assessment is updated. The transfer is completely airtight. We just need to make sure the paperwork is executed by 10 tomorrow morning." "And your father-in-law?" Catherine murmured, her footsteps stopping right beside my IV stand. "Is Richard still playing the grieving parent? Or is he on board?" "He's signing his portion of the waiver tonight," Julian said, his voice entirely devoid of the warmth he used to reserve for me. "He doesn't want a public mess any more than we do. He knows what happens to his lifestyle if that trust goes into probate." Listening to them, I realized something that shifted the very core of who I was. The terrible highway accident that had shattered my car 3 weeks ago wasn't the most dangerous thing that had happened to me this month. The true danger was right here, breathing the same air I was, waiting for the clock to run out on my life. They weren't praying for me to open my eyes. They were counting down the hours until they could legally erase me. To understand how my husband and my stepmother ended up standing over my seemingly unconscious body, mapping out the theft of my life, we have to go back. We have to look at the foundation of everything they were trying to take. Pull up a chair, take a sip of your coffee, and let me tell you about my mother Vivienne. Vivienne was not a loud woman, but she was a formidable one. She built a highly successful textile manufacturing business from the ground up in an era when women weren't even allowed in the boardroom without a man's permission. She didn't build a global empire, but she bought undervalued commercial mills, modernized their supply chains, and established relationships with high-end designers who valued quality over cheap labor. She was a woman of absolute precision. She kept records the way architects keep structural blueprints, with the deep, quiet understanding that accuracy wasn't just administrative bureaucracies. It was protection. And that protection was always meant for me, the person who would come after her, rather than for herself. I remember a rainy Tuesday evening when I was just 12 years old. I was sitting at the heavy mahogany dining table, struggling with a pre-algebra assignment, while my mother sat at the other end with a magnifying glass, cross-referencing a stack of shipping manifests that looked 3 feet high. "Mom!" I groaned, throwing my pencil down. "Why do you check every single line? Can't you just trust the warehouse managers to do their job?" She stopped, lowered the magnifying glass, and looked at me with those steady, fiercely protective gray eyes. "Accuracy isn't about paperwork, Elena," she said. Her voice thin but steady, from the early stages of the illness she was already hiding from the world. "It's the armor you leave behind for the people you love. People will always try to cut corners, and when they do, the only thing standing between you and ruin is the clarity of what you put down on paper." I didn't fully grasp what she meant then. I was 12. I thought armor meant shields and swords, not legal clauses and ledger entries. But 2 years later, when an aggressive form of cancer took her away from me in less than 8 months, the true scope of her precision began to reveal itself. She had spent the final weeks of her life doing something I wouldn't fully comprehend until I was old enough to face the wolves myself. She wasn't just mourning her limited time, she was systematically ensuring that everything she had sweated and bled to build would reach me securely, specifically bypassing the people who would inevitably come after her. When I turned 30, a sealed manila envelope was delivered to my apartment by her lifelong estate attorney, a woman named Clara. On the front, my name was written in my mother's elegant, unmistakable cursive handwriting. Inside was a letter that had been waiting 16 years for me to read it. The letter said, among many things, that she had structured her commercial assets into an independent, locked trust. She wrote that she wasn't naive about what unearned money did to people who believed they had an emotional claim on it. She explicitly stated that the intricate legal protections she had built weren't because she didn't trust me to be smart. They were because she did trust me, and she wanted to make sure that trust was backed up by the rigid systems of the law, even when the human beings around me proved to be completely untrustworthy. I sat on my sofa that morning, letting my coffee go cold, feeling the echo of her love radiating through those typed pages. I felt incredibly secure. I believed that because the documents were airtight, my life was safe. What I didn't understand yet, what took me another year and a near-fatal accident to learn, was that a legal document is only as strong as your awareness of the people who are trying to read it. My mother had handed me a magnificent shield, but she couldn't force me to look at the people standing right next to me holding knives. If you've ever felt like you had to grow up too fast, or if you've ever realized that a parent's strictness was actually a quiet, desperate attempt to shield you from things you couldn't see yet, type the word armor in the comments below. Let me know I'm not the only one who had to decode their legacy long after it was left behind. Now, let me tell you about how the shadows found their way into my life. Enter Julian. I met him at a charity gala for historical preservation 3 years after my mother's letter arrived. He was an architectural consultant, highly respected for his ability to evaluate old structures and determine whether they could be salvaged or retrofitted for modern commercial use. He was charming in a quiet, grounded way, not flashy, not aggressive. He had this incredible knack for looking at a room and understanding exactly what it needed, then providing it without seeming like he was putting on a performance. When we started dating, he didn't push to know about my finances. He didn't ask intrusive questions. Instead, he expressed a profound, deeply respectful admiration for my mother's legacy. He wanted to see the old mills. He wanted to hear the stories of how Vivienne had negotiated with tough union reps and turned failing properties into gold. He made me feel like he didn't just love me. He loved the history I carried. He made me feel safe. But looking back, with the absolute clarity that only comes when you are forced to lie perfectly still in a hospital bed, I can see the exact moment the texture of his interest shifted. It happened about 6 months into our marriage, during our honeymoon in upstate New York. We were staying at a beautiful lodge overlooking a pristine, isolated lake. On our third afternoon, we took a drive into a nearby historic town, and we stopped in front of a gorgeous, abandoned 19th-century brick storehouse, right on the water. Julian got out of the car, stepped up to the rusted iron gates, and looked at the structure with an intensity that I mistook for professional passion. I walked up behind him, wrapping my arms around his waist. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" I murmured, resting my chin on his shoulder. He didn't turn around. He just kept staring at the brickwork. And then, his voice dropping into that casual, conversational tone he used when he wanted to test the waters, he asked, "Does your mother's trust allow for collateral development on secondary markets, Elena, or is it strictly locked into the existing urban manufacturing zones?" I laughed it off. I remember squeezing his waist and saying, "Oh, darling, don't bring work on our honeymoon. Let Clara worry about the legal boundaries." He smiled, turned around, and kissed my forehead. He dropped the subject instantly. It was a masterclass in subtlety. He didn't push because he didn't need to. He was planting a seed. He was testing the perimeter of the fortress my mother had built, trying to see where the walls were soft. That short exchange was a parasitic memory that kept flashing behind my closed eyelids in the ICU. It was a clue I had completely ignored because I loved him. I had rationalized his curiosity as shared ambition. I wanted to believe he was building a life with me, when in reality, he was meticulously drafting a blueprint to build a life on top of me. My stepmother, Catherine, entered the picture shortly after. She had married my father, Richard, a few years after my mother passed, and she immediately formed a tight, quiet alliance with Julian. They were cut from the same cloth. Both of them possessed the terrifying social fluency of people who study you, not to know you, but to catalog your vulnerabilities. While my father retreated into a comfortable, passive retirement, funded largely by the allowances my mother had legally permitted him from her estate, Catherine and Julian began a silent choreography. They would sit together at family dinners, speaking in low, harmonious voices, trading observations about the rising value of commercial land holdings. They were never rude to me. In fact, they were incredibly kind. They would buy me gifts, check in on my stress levels, and encourage me to take vacations. "You work too hard, Elena," Catherine would say, pouring me a glass of wine. "You need to let Julian help you manage the burden of those properties. He has such a brilliant mind for development." It was a beautiful, suffocating web. They were setting up the board, piece by piece, waiting for the perfect moment when the controlling beneficiary of the Vivienne Ross Trust would look away from the ledger long enough for them to slip their hands inside. There is a profound, terrifying difference between being useful to someone and being truly wanted for who you are. It's a lesson that usually costs you something precious to learn. When you are wanted, your presence is enough. Your flaws are held with grace, and your boundaries are respected as a natural extension of your individuality. But when you are merely useful, you are treated like a beautifully engineered tool. You are polished, you are praised, and you are kept clean. Not because the person loves the tool, but because they love what the tool can harvest for them. And the moment that tool stops performing, or the moment they find a way to automate its function, the care completely vanishes. I want to look you in the eyes right now, metaphorically, through this coffee cup I'm holding, and ask you a very real question. Have you ever been in a relationship where you felt incredibly secure, only to realize later that your security was actually a cage built out of your own utility? Did you ignore the cold, transactional look in their eyes because their words sounded so warm? If this is hitting a nerve, if you've ever had to wake up from the illusion of a safe love, pause this video right now and type the word boundaries in the comments section. Let's own our history, because realizing you were used is the first step toward becoming completely untouchable. For the first 2 years of our marriage, Julian made me feel like the center of his universe. But looking back from this hospital bed, I can see that my primary value to him was my proximity to the milestone of my 31st birthday. That was the year the secondary tier of my mother's trust was legally scheduled to activate. Vivian had structured the assets so that at age 25, I received the baseline income and basic oversight of the manufacturing plants. But at age 31, the full, unmitigated ownership of the commercial land holdings, the literal earth underneath those mills, which had skyrocketed in value due to urban rezoning, would transfer entirely into my personal control. As that birthday approached, the atmospheric pressure in our home began to change. Julian didn't become mean, he became intense. He started bringing home thick folders of development proposals, maps of the industrial sectors, and market analysis reports. "Alina, look at this," he would say, spreading a massive blueprint across our kitchen island while I was trying to cook dinner. "The city is expanding right toward the old riverfront mill. If we convert that acreage into a mixed-use retail and luxury residential hub, the trust's value triples overnight. We just need to restructure the internal corporate governance so I have the signature authority to sign off on the construction loans." "Julian, please," I had laughed, stirring a pot of pasta, completely oblivious to the desperation hidden behind his eyes. My mother chose Clara to be the independent financial manager for a reason. "I don't want to change the governance. The system works exactly the way it is." He had gone completely rigid. It lasted for less than a second, but I remember the way his jaw tightened, the way the warmth drained from his face, leaving behind the cold, calculating mask of a corporate raider looking at an obstacle. "Clara is a retired estate attorney, Elena," he said, his voice dropping into a flat, quiet tone that sent a momentary shiver down my spine. "She's thinking about the past. I'm trying to build our future. Don't you trust your husband?" That phrase, "Don't you trust your husband?" It's the ultimate emotional weapon. It's designed to make you feel guilty for having an instinct. It forces you to choose between your own intuition and the harmony of your marriage. And like a fool, I chose the harmony. I apologized. I told him of course I trusted him, but I still didn't sign the restructuring paperwork. I told him we would talk about it after my 31st birthday in September. They couldn't afford to wait until September, because they knew that once that milestone hit, my personal signature would become the absolute, unchallengeable law of the estate, and Clara's oversight would tighten into a permanent ironclad stewardship. They needed me to cede control before the activation happened. They needed a vulnerability. They needed an opening in the fortress. And then, on a rainy Thursday evening in late August, the universe handed them exactly what they had been praying for, on a silver platter. The rain that Thursday evening wasn't just falling. It was a heavy, suffocating sheet of water that completely erased the lane lines on Route 9. I was driving back from a late inspection of one of our suburban commercial hubs, my mind entirely occupied by a minor roofing leak a tenant had reported. The windshield wipers were at their maximum speed, creating a rhythmic, hypnotic slap against the glass that, looking back, had dulled my reaction times just enough to be fatal. I remember approaching the intersection at Cypress Avenue. I had the green light. I remember the exact quality of the dark gray sky, the way the brake lights of the cars ahead reflected off the flooded asphalt like bleeding neon ribbons. And then, out of nowhere, a massive commercial flatbed truck hydroplaned through the red light from my left. I didn't even have time to scream. There was no screech of tires, no dramatic cinematic slow-motion sequence. There was only the sudden, terrifying sight of a wall of rusted steel rushing toward my driver's side window. The deafening explosion of shattering safety glass, the brutal, crushing physics of metal folding in on my body, and then absolute, unmitigated blackness. For 21 days, my body was a resident of the intensive care unit, locked in what the medical team described to my family as a deep, unresponsive state. But what the doctors didn't realize, what the monitoring equipment failed to cleanly register, is that the human brain doesn't just turn off when the eyes close. It fights. It stays behind in the dark, gathering crumbs of data from the outside world, like a desperate survivor listening to a faint radio transmission. I came back in fragments. First came the sound of the ambient environment, the rhythmic, mechanical hiss and click of a ventilator pushing oxygen into my uncooperative lungs. Then came the heavy chemical scent of institutional bleach and the coarse, scratching texture of hospital cotton against my bare skin. But the most vivid fragments were the voices. People think an unconscious person is an empty room. They stand over you and empty their pockets of secrets, completely convinced that because your fingers don't move, your mind isn't recording the transcript. They spoke with the lowered, theatrical voices people reserve for medical spaces, and they left a trail of evidence behind them that my recovering brain systematically began to reconstruct. Julian visited 7 times. I know because I counted the distinct heavy thud of his Italian leather loafers every time he crossed the threshold. In the beginning, his voice carried the performed tremor of a devastated, grieving husband. He would hold my limp hand, his fingers pressing into my skin with a tight, desperate grip that I initially interpreted as love. He would whisper to the attending physicians, asking about the exact timeline of my neurological decay. "Is there any sign of cortical activity, doctor?" he would ask, his voice dripping with synthetic concern. "The swelling is stable, Mr. Ross," Dr. Okafor would reply, her footsteps crisp and efficient. "But the longer she remains in this state without demonstrating purposeful interaction, the lower the probability of a full cognitive recovery. We will run a comprehensive capacity assessment next Friday to make a permanent determination." "I understand," Julian would murmur. "It's just, the uncertainty is tearing our family apart. We just want to do what's best for her affairs." That was the first red flag my subconscious cataloged. He didn't ask how to make me comfortable. He didn't ask if I was in pain. He asked about the timeline. He was treating my survival like a legal deadline that he had to beat. The grief in his voice wasn't a lament for the woman he loved. It was the anxiety of a businessman watching an investment window close. By the third week, the performance of grief had completely vanished behind the closed door of my room. They believed I was a vegetative prop, a silent witness who couldn't file away their words. On that fateful Thursday morning, when my conscious mind finally broke through the surface of the dark, I was forced to listen to the clinical, chilling execution of their strategy. Catherine and Julian had brought an outside corporate compliance attorney named Vance directly into the ICU. I could hear the rustle of heavy legal-grade paper right at the foot of my bed, completely overriding the gentle hum of the medical equipment. The language in Vivienne's primary trust document is incredibly rigid, Catherine, Vance said, his voice dropping into a low, professional drone. If Elena passes away or is declared permanently incompetent by the medical board on Monday, the entire commercial land portfolio automatically defaults into a secondary charitable foundation managed exclusively by Clara Holt. You and Richard won't have a single legal foot to stand on. We aren't waiting for her to pass away, Vance, Catherine hissed, the mask of the loving stepmother entirely gone, replaced by a sharp, venomous desperation. And we aren't waiting for Monday's board decision either. We are weaponizing the temporary asset management gap. Look at subsection 4, paragraph B. During a period of documented medical incapacitation, before a permanent prognosis is issued. The corporate bylaws allow the immediate family to appoint an emergency proxy to manage the voting shares of the manufacturing plants. We just need to execute this emergency transfer before her capacity assessment is updated. And Julian has full authority to sign as her husband? Vance asked. Richard signed his parental waiver 2 hours ago at the hotel, Julian replied, his voice entirely flat, entirely pragmatic. Once I sign this emergency proxy as her medical next of kin, we control 51% of the corporate board. By 10 tomorrow morning, we can vote to dissolve the manufacturing operations, sell the underlying riverfront land to the luxury development group, and route the liquidated cash directly into our personal offshore holding company before Clara even realizes the board meeting was called. It's brilliant, Julian, Catherine whispered, and I could hear the genuine, twisted admiration in her voice. One more signature tomorrow at 9, and it's all ours. Her mother thought she built a fortress, but she forgot that a fortress is completely useless if the husband holds the keys to the front gate. Lying there in the silence that followed, my heart was screaming, but my body remained perfectly, terrifyingly still. The sheer, calculated intelligence of their plan was breathtaking. They weren't cartoon villains trying to pull the plug on my life support. They were sophisticated financial predators who had found a highly logical, legal loophole in the timing of my tragedy. They were using the very machinery of the law to rob me while I was trapped inside my own skull. But the absolute worst part of what I heard wasn't Catherine's greed or Vance's clinical compliance. It was my husband's complete lack of hesitation. Julian wasn't a man who had been manipulated or tricked into this betrayal. He was an active architect of it. He had looked at my broken, shattered body in that bed, calculated the exact dollar value of my absence, and decided that 51% of a manufacturing trust was worth more than the soul of the woman he had sworn to protect. He had caved to his own insecurity and Catherine's ambition because he could never handle the fact that my mother's legacy had made me completely independent of him. He didn't want a partner, he wanted a payout, and he was entirely willing to let the clock run out on my life to get it. They left my room at precisely 11:40 a.m. to finalize the transaction details with Vance at a nearby coffee shop. The moment the heavy wooden door clicked shut behind them, the absolute silence of the room rushed back in, punctuated only by the mocking, rhythmic hiss of my ventilator. I lay there for 20 agonizing minutes, letting the absolute weight of their betrayal settle into my bones before I finally allowed myself to open my eyes. The ceiling of an intensive care unit is a very specific, unforgiving shade of institutional white. It is designed to give a patient absolutely nothing to look at that could stimulate an emotional response in either direction. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity, taking a slow internal inventory of my own body. I could move my fingers. I could turn my head slightly to the left, though a dull, throbbing ache pulsed behind my temples with the steady persistence of a car alarm in the distance. The right side of my body felt incredibly heavy from 3 weeks of forced disuse, but the motor functions were intact. I was alive. I was functional. And most importantly, for the next 22 hours, I was strategically positioned in the shadows. But I couldn't do this alone. I was weak, hooked up to a cocktail of intravenous medications, and legally considered a ghost. I needed two things immediately: an ally inside this building who understood the clinical reality of my recovery, and a way to bypass the strict family visitor log to reach my godmother, Clara, before that 10 a.m. deadline tomorrow morning. The universe, it turned out, had already provided the first piece of the puzzle. At 4:30 that afternoon, the heavy door swung open and the shift nurse, a woman named Maya, walked in to check my evening vitals. She was a quiet, meticulous woman in her late 40s who had been managing my primary care since week 2. She approached the side of my bed, her face a mask of professional, clinical composure, and reached down to check my pulse. She placed her index and middle fingers right against the inside of my left wrist. This was my only window. I waited for her fingers to settle, and then, using every single ounce of neural energy I could muster, I pressed back. I squeezed my fingers together, exerting a sharp, deliberate pulse of pressure directly against her wrist. It was a tiny, barely perceptible signal, the kind of physical communication that only registers if the person on the receiving end is already paying the exact right kind of attention. Maya went completely rigid. She didn't gasp, she didn't panic, and she didn't look toward the observation window in the door. She simply maintained her professional posture, her eyes fixed steadily on the cardiac monitor while she processed the shocking data running through her fingers. She leaned slightly closer to my pillow, pretending to adjust the tubing of my oxygen line, and whispered, barely above the sound of her own breath, "Blink twice if you can hear me, Elena." I blinked twice, my eyelids heavy but entirely deliberate. "Good," she murmured, her voice carrying a deep, reassuring calm. "You've been showing micro signs of cognitive awareness on the EEG for 2 days. I documented it in my private personal shift notes, not in the main digital chart. I didn't know who to trust in your family, Elena. Your husband has been asking very strange questions about your brain death criteria." I pressed her wrist once for affirmation. "There is a woman named Clara who has tried to visit you 3 times over the last 2 weeks," Maya whispered quickly, her eyes constantly darting toward the door. "She signed in as your legal counsel, but your stepmother had her removed from the approved family list by the hospital administration. Do you want me to contact her?" I pressed her wrist again, one sharp squeeze for yes. Maya reached into her scrubs, pulled out a small, sterile notepad and a pen from her supply cart, and placed them gently under my right hand beneath the privacy blanket. My fingers were stiff, and my coordination was deeply compromised by the rawness of 21 days of intubation. But I managed to drag the pen across the paper. I wrote her name, Clara Holt, and her private cell phone number, which I had memorized when I was 14 years old and had never once forgotten. Beneath the numbers, I scrawled a single desperate word: tonight. Maya took the paper, folded it flat, and slipped it directly into her pocket. I will call her from my personal cell phone. On my 15-minute break in the parking garage. Not from the hospital network, she whispered, squeezing my hand back with a warmth that felt like life itself rushing back into my veins. Keep your eyes closed for anyone else tonight, Elena. Don't let them see you wake up until the armor is ready. Clara arrived at exactly 8:45 p.m. Maya had managed to slip her through the secondary oncology service entrance, entirely bypassing the main security desk where Julian had established his daily perimeter. When the door opened and Clara stepped into the dim light of my room, the sheer relief that washed over me was indescribable. She looked exactly as she always did, sharp, impeccably tailored, her silver hair pulled back into a tight, professional bun, carrying a heavy leather briefcase that looked more like a precision weapon than an administrative tool. She didn't cry. She didn't waste a single moment on theatrical displays of sympathy. She walked straight to the side of my bed, leaned down, and looked directly into my open eyes with an unshakable focus. "Hello, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice a soothing, ironclad anchor in the clinical chaos. Maya told me everything on her break. I knew Julian was a snake the moment he started auditing the company assets last year, but I didn't think he would have the nerve to move this quickly. "Are you completely with me, Elena?" I nodded, my voice finally cracking through the dryness of my throat like broken glass. "I can speak, Clara, but it hurts. They have an emergency corporate proxy meeting at 10 tomorrow morning. They brought an attorney named Vance. They are going to dissolve the manufacturing plant and liquidate the riverfront land while I'm trapped in this bed." Clara smiled, a cold, sharp expression that made her look exactly like the brilliant trial attorney she had been for 30 years. She set her briefcase on my bedside table, popped the heavy brass latches with a loud, satisfying click, and pulled out a thick, pristine copy of my mother's original corporate trust charter. "Let them have their meeting, Elena," Clara murmured, tapping the folder with her fingernail. "Because they are playing cheap checkers. And your mother spent the last 7 days of her life teaching me how to play Grandmaster chess." She leaned in closer, flipping the pages to a specific section highlighted in dark yellow ink. "Julian and Catherine are relying on standard corporate compliance bylaws. They think that because you are medically incapacitated, your next of kin can automatically execute an emergency management proxy to handle your voting shares. And under standard law, they would be absolutely right. But what they don't know, what Julian completely missed, because he only reviewed the baseline public filings, is what Vivienne did during a 3-hour phone call with me from her hospice bed just 4 days before she passed away." I stared at her, my heart beating with a sudden wild hope. "What did she do?" "She added a non-standard hidden rider to the internal corporate charter," Clara explained, her eyes gleaming with genuine admiration for my mother's ultimate foresight. "We called it the dual authorization safety lock. It explicitly stipulates that during any documented period of temporary medical incapacitation of the primary beneficiary, any reallocation of core real estate assets or dissolution of manufacturing operations requires the physical, verified signature of a designated independent corporate protector. And that protector, by name and by permanent legal appointment, is me." She paused, letting the immense weight of those words fill the sterile air of the room. "Julian can sign his emergency proxy until his hand bleeds, Elena. But without my physical signature on that Stage 3 authorization clause, his documents are completely unexecutable under corporate law. They are nothing more than incredibly expensive scratch paper." "But they have Vance," I whispered, the steady ache in my head completely fading as the strategy took shape in my mind. Vance will try to find a loophole to bypass you. Vance cannot bypass a charter restriction he doesn't even know exists, Clara replied smoothly. And by 10 tomorrow morning, he won't even have the legal standing to try. Because we aren't just relying on your mother's paperwork tonight. We are relying on your living voice. Right on cue, the door opened softly, and Maya stepped back into the room, accompanied by Dr. Okafor, the attending neurologist who had been managing my intensive care. Dr. Okafor looked at me with a mixture of professional awe and deep clinical intensity. She held a digital tablet in her hand, already pulled up to my official medical file. "Alina," Dr. Okafor said quietly, stepping up to my monitors. "Nurse Maya has presented me with her personal shift notes, and I have just conducted a visual assessment of your pupillary response and cognitive tracking. You are fully lucid, perfectly oriented to time and place, and entirely capable of making your own legal and medical decisions. I am updating your official electronic health record right now. As of 9:15 p.m., your temporary medical incapacitation is officially terminated." Clara immediately pulled a single-page document from her briefcase, a formal timestamped declaration of full cognitive awareness and the immediate retroactive revocation of all medical proxies. I took the heavy fountain pen from Clara's hand. My fingers were trembling, my muscles screaming from the lingering trauma of the accident, but I pressed the nib into the paper and signed my name with the absolute, unshakable precision my mother had taught me. Maya and Dr. Okafor signed directly beneath me as official medical witnesses. By 10 p.m., the Trust's independent financial manager had processed the digital health update. By 11:30 p.m., Clara had filed an emergency ex parte injunction with the night duty judge at the probate court, freezing all internal corporate transactions pending a full judicial capacity review on Monday morning. The trap was completely set. Julian and Catherine thought they were walking into a hospital room tomorrow morning to execute the final signature on a defenseless woman's life. They had absolutely no idea that they were walking directly into a steel cage built 18 years ago by a dying woman who loved her daughter enough to look into the future and completely outsmart the wolves. Hargrove, the compliance attorney Julian and Catherine had hired, arrived at exactly 9:04 a.m. the next morning. I know the exact time because Maya was stationed at the fourth-floor nurse's desk when he stepped out of the elevator, and she immediately sent a text to the burner phone Clara had left hidden under my mattress. I slipped the phone out of sight, pulled my pillows up so I was sitting completely upright, and took a slow, deliberate sip from the glass of water on my bedside table. When the heavy wooden door swung open, Julian and Catherine walked in with the easy, casual confidence of predators who believe their prey is still sound asleep. Julian was carrying a sleek leather folder under his arm, his face schooled into that familiar, somber expression of a mourning husband preparing to perform a tragic but necessary duty. Catherine was a step behind him, her eyes already fixed on the foot of my bed where the medical charts usually hung. Then they looked up. They saw my eyes wide open. They saw me holding the glass of water. They saw Clara sitting calmly in the vinyl chair by the window, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she flipped through a stack of court-stamped documents. And they saw David Chen, a razor-sharp medical legal attorney Clara had brought in at sunrise, standing near the sink with his hands folded neatly behind his back. The physical reaction was instantaneous. I watched the blood drain completely from Julian's face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. He stopped dead in his tracks, his leather folder slipping a fraction of an inch under his arm. Catherine actually gasped, her hand flying to her throat as her eyes darted frantically between me and Clara like a trapped animal. trying to locate an exit in a collapsing tunnel. "Good morning, Julian. Catherine," I said. My voice was still thin, carrying the raspy, hollow quality of a throat that had spent 3 weeks fighting a plastic tube, but it was clear, it was steady, and it filled the sterile room with an absolute authority that hadn't been there the day before. Hargrove looked around the room for approximately 4 seconds. As an experienced corporate attorney, he read the landscape instantly. He saw the court stamps on Clara's folders. He recognized David Chen's name on the legal badge pinned to his lapel, and he immediately understood that the emergency proxy document under Julian's arm was dead on arrival. Without saying a single word to his clients, Hargrove stepped back into the hallway, leaving Julian and Catherine completely exposed. "Elena," Julian stammered, stepping toward the bed, his voice trembling as he tried to force the warmth back into his eyes. You're awake. Sweetheart, thank God. We were so worried. We were just trying to handle the corporate filings so you wouldn't have to face the stress when you came out of it." "I've been awake since yesterday afternoon, Julian," I said, my gaze locked onto his with a cold, unblinking intensity that made him step back. "I heard you on Thursday morning. I heard you standing right here, at the foot of my bed, with Catherine. I heard every single word about the emergency proxy, the corporate board seats, and the signature you needed before 10 o'clock today." Catherine tried to step forward, her face twisting into a mask of frantic defensive calculation. "Elena, you don't understand. The medical bills, the urban restructuring. Clara has already filed an emergency ex parte injunction with the probate court," I interrupted, my voice dropping into a flat, clinical tone that completely silenced her. "Dr. Okafor updated my capacity assessment last night. My temporary incapacitation is legally over. Your medical proxies are revoked. The trust accounts are permanently frozen pending a full forensic audit, and your emergency corporate meeting this morning has been canceled by judicial order." The legal fallout that followed over the next 4 months moved with the slow, devastating thoroughness of a grinding stone. Catherine was arrested in late January after a comprehensive district attorney investigation uncovered a cache of forged historical shipping manifests she and Hargrove had prepared to bypass Clara's initial corporate objections. The forgery charges elevated the case from a civil family dispute into a major criminal matter with clear, undeniable evidence of fraudulent intent. Hargrove surrendered his law license 3 weeks later to avoid formal disbarment proceedings. My father, Richard, faced severe civil liability for his compliance in signing the parental waivers. Under a court-mandated settlement, he was permanently stripped of his role as co-trustee and forced to liquidate his personal luxury assets to pay back every single dollar he had surreptitiously drawn from my mother's estate during my hospitalization. By the time the final decrees were signed, Julian had filed for bankruptcy, completely abandoned by Catherine, the moment their shared financial leverage vanished into thin air. He was left with absolutely nothing but the hollow echo of his own greed. I walked out of that hospital 12 days after the confrontation. Maya walked me all the way to the glass sliding doors at the main exit. I turned to her, pulling her into a tight, emotional embrace. "You saved my life, Maya," I whispered. "You were the only person in that room who was actually paying attention." She smiled, squeezing my shoulder gently. "I just listened, Elena. Your mother is the one who built the walls. I just made sure the right person got the message." 2 weeks later, Clara came over to my apartment for dinner. I had cooked a simple, traditional roasted chicken recipe my mother had taught me when I was a teenager, focusing on patience and precision rather than speed. We sat at the small kitchen table, the city lights twinkling through the window. drinking wine and talking about everything except the court case. You know, Clara said softly, looking down at her glass. Vivienne called me from the hospice ward the week before she passed. She told me she had this overwhelming, heavy feeling that she hadn't done enough to protect you. She said, Clara, the people who try to take what you love aren't going to come from the outside with masks on. They are going to sit at your dinner table and smile at your daughter. That's the exact night. She made me add the Stage 3 authorization clause. I sat there in the quiet apartment, looking at the elegant, faded ink of my mother's handwriting on the old trust document resting on the counter. I realized then that my mother couldn't physically be in that sterile hospital room with me when I woke up from the dark. She couldn't hold my hand, and she couldn't tell Julian to step away from my bed. But what she built was there. Her intelligence, her accuracy, and her absolute refusal to compromise on the truth were standing guard over my life 18 years after she left this earth. Precision, it turns out, isn't just about ledger lines, legal clauses, or administrative paperwork. Precision is the most durable, unshakable form of love a mother can ever leave behind.